Introducing Portraits and Ideas. I'm Erlen Gal presenting interviews to inspire and perhaps unveil something new in the realm of ideas. We'd like to introduce you today Professor Chris Gehring, Professor of Plant Science at KAUS, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. What is your position at KAUS and your major objectives?
I have a position of Professor of Plant Science, and I work in association with the CBRC, the Computational Bioscience Research Centre, and in fact my research has two components. One is an experimental component, which is heavily dependent on the laboratory, and we're doing experiments partly in the laboratory, partly in the greenhouse, etc. And the other component of my research is computational, where we look at making sense of high throughput data which we accumulate ourselves in the lab, or data which is in the public domain. And I think the general topic is plant stress responses, and in particular plant stress signaling. And the ultimate goal, the long-term goal, is basically to engineer plants that have an increased tolerance to drought and other stress situations. I think that's the goal.
Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to youth in Saudi Arabia or the region to promote their interest in pursuing science and technology careers?
Well, I think the first thing that is important is that one is aware that before you can go into research and further studies, a very solid background in the basic sciences is required, in particular in biology. So if you are interested in the life sciences, biology, etc., then you need a good grounding in physics, you need a good grounding in chemistry, and in part in computational methods as well, because it turns out that science, the life sciences in particular, will become more and more analytical, more and more dependent on chemical and physical tools and computational tools as well. So it's important that one pursues a very solid grounding in the classic sciences, and then, be aware that it takes time to mature into a scientist. I mean, it is in the biological sciences not really feasible to start thinking of doing serious research without a master's and subsequently a PhD degree. So if one is interested in pursuing a career in the biological sciences, then really one would have to aim for a training which is not really near to completion before a PhD. I think that's what I would say.
Why do you think science would be more of an attractive area for youth in the present generation to pursue in comparison, say, to other disciplines, based on your personal experience?
Well, science is a method. It's a method of inquiry where analytical tools are used to ask and answer questions. So science, as we do it these days, is the strict application of a method. That's the one bit. On the other hand, it's amazing that something with such rigorous requirements and something which requires so much discipline also has playful aspects. There are aspects of surprises. You ask a question, you can get very surprising answers, and it's sometimes quite interesting to actually match questions and answers. And what can also happen is that you ask a question, you get an answer, and you then realize that this is really the answer to a question you have never asked. So what you're getting is a very strong challenge of the mind. On the one hand, you want discipline. On the other hand, there is ample of room for creativity. And I sometimes liken it to playing chess. So it can be very rewarding if you do well. And well, I think it is a great way of earning a living and spending one's time.
I can sense your excitement about the work that you do. It's kind of a joy every day. You wake up to head to the lab and to head to your office to pursue the next challenge.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
Well, also some challenges are really long time and long term, should I say. I'm working on some questions that have been with me for over a decade, and lots of progress has been made, but we're not necessarily closer to the final answer, and that's another thing. I mean, maybe there is no such thing as a final answer. It's a path, it's a journey, and along the journey there are very important discoveries to be made, some of which actually will have applications and can, when applied rationally and responsibly, make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm. So, that leads to the question, you're obviously going over an issue for a lengthy period of time, like a decade.
Mm.
You must have some stone walls that you run into, and dead ends, quote dead ends. Perhaps they're not really dead ends, but how do you work your way around that psychologically and actually in the actions that you take? Because there's a tendency perhaps for some people to give up when they reach an impasse in a given query or question.
Yeah, well, we have some defense mechanisms here. And I'm telling you what I tell my students. Well, first of all, my graduate students, my PhD students, they are always working on two questions simultaneously. One question is a question which we know can be answered if you are persistent enough and just do well what one can do. It's the sort of bread and butter research. And I can with confidence say, well, if you use these methods, apply them to this problem, you will get answers. And then there is a second set of questions, which is much more fundamental and much more difficult. And here the point is, even if you don't succeed, at least you get a feeling of what it is to be in front of what you call a stone wall. And, sometimes someone makes or takes an extraordinary leap and actually manages to get over it, and that then of course really does create major excitement. But it's not all major excitement, and you give yourself the chance to do less spectacular things just to sort of tick over. So that's a sort of a balance. And of course, there are also major stonewall questions, as it were, that you can approach, you can make suggestions to go forward, and then you sometimes just have to wait. And there may be, from completely different areas of science, suddenly new tools or new suggestions that come up, and you can then integrate them and then take the next step. So some questions remain in a way on the burner, and you think about them, but you know when the time is right to actually then make a move. But what you don't do is just sit in front of a problem and wait. That is not what you do.
So I can see your technique with your graduate students is quite remarkable in that you give them some hope for solving something, but give them something that's a difficult challenge that they can stretch a bit you know, in their thinking.
That's right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's basically the bread and butter where I basically say, well, you know, this is what it takes to get a PhD. So if you do that, well, you're coming very close. And then there are other things which are a bonus. And if they don't work, it's not a major tragedy because you can still write it up and you can write what the challenges were. And if it does work, of course, then it is great excitement. And I must say, some of my students have managed to make major inroads and have produced some scientific papers that have enjoyed considerable international acclaim and have been cited.
We'll get into it. I'll actually ask you about that a little bit later. Let's. How did you reach the position you're in today in your profession? In a sense, please outline your career and explain the milestones in your educational advancement to your PhD.
Well, I actually started my undergraduate years, I think it must have been 1971, at the University of Basel in Switzerland, at the then newly constructed Biocenter. And it was a very exciting time when the university decided to go from the more classical biology to molecular biology and sort of chemically and physically based biology. And I was very fortunate actually that one of our professors there was Werner Aber, who subsequently got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the restriction enzymes. So it was a time of great hope and really an initial budding of cell and molecular biology. And after my degree there, I decided I wanted to go a bit further afield. I then went for a year to Scotland, where I worked with Ed Southern and Adrian Bird. Then after a year, I decided to go south to London to do my PhD in London, working on a more biophysical tool, on my biophysical theme. I was working then on potassium and calcium exchanges in isolated mitochondria. And then I returned briefly back to Switzerland for a year and applied for an EMBO fellowship. That's a European Molecular Biology Organization fellowship. And I was lucky enough to be awarded one. And then went to Rome with the fellowship to work at the Centro Acidi Nucleici, which was probably then the leading Italian center for nucleic acid research, where I worked on the processing of ribosomal protein genes. And again, I briefly returned to Switzerland, where out of the blue, my professor there asked me whether I would like to join him to start a new molecular biology lab at La Trobe University in Australia, and I spontaneously said yes, followed him to Australia and stayed there for 12 years before going to South Africa, taking up a chair in plant biotechnology, and now I'm here at KAUST.
What a remarkable journey you've had, and certainly that would give a lot of inspiration to youth that, you know, as you journey in this pathway of science, that there's extraordinarily great experiences and people and countries and challenges that you face. What would you say, when you look back on your work, would be the relative advantage of hard work versus high levels of intelligence to accomplish goals in science?
Well, you see, there really isn't much. There really isn't much hope without work. Being intelligent, well, there's a lot of intelligent people around and a lot of talented people around, but the difference between those who succeed and those who just have their talents untapped is really the hard work and the dedication. So now, you know, hard work sounds painful, but it's not actually painful. It's also, you know, if I look back, I don't think I ever worked hard in the sense of having pain over my work. It was much more a situation of knowing that you had to do something worthwhile, and you spend a lot of time doing it because that's what we do. And, you know, if you have some talents and are interested and enthused by a topic, work in a conducive environment with interesting colleagues and inspirational teachers, well, you know, what sounds like hard work and a pain is in fact not perceived as that. It's just a great way of spending your time.
When did you decide to become a scientist and a researcher in your career? You know, like I'm thinking about particularly about childhood stimuli that you may have had that inspired you to become a scientist.
I guess it was in some way almost a decision to do something different from what the people in my family did. Most people in my family are either lawyers or in business or you know, in some sort of managerial position. And I, you know, especially in law, when I saw my family members talking about cases, I always found that not particularly interesting. I thought maybe I'm more interested in something of general interest and in something incredibly fundamental like the understanding of nature, and even during my school days I actually wasn't excelling in the sciences at all. But then I suddenly, you know, when it came to choosing a direction at university, I decided, well, why don't I do something which I don't know an awful lot about, but something that interests me, something that I feel will develop, and something that gives me a chance to actually work in different places all over the world. Because, as you well know, if you do, for instance, law, it's very difficult to travel because of the different legal systems in different countries, whereas the scientific community is not only international, the scientific community is international and is forced to be international because that's the way it works. I mean, it's, you know, there are no borders. I have worked in a handful of different countries, as I told you, met innumerous people who have done their degrees in different places. So I think science is really transcending national and ideological borders. It's a great way to actually be in touch with people from other cultures. And, you know, we share a belief that certain methods will work, and we understand that these methods work independent of the personal and political backgrounds of people. And I think this is actually a great feeling of universality. And in a way, you find this only maybe in music.
Yeah, I was thinking along those lines.
Exactly,
the universal language, science or music.
Yeah,
right.
You know, where you basically say, well, you actually are performing with people from very, very different backgrounds, and you can share great experiences.
Exactly. It's an incredible community.
Yeah, that's right.
To be a part of.
That's right.
What scientists in your youth inspired you the most, and why?
Well, you know, obviously there are the scientists you know particularly well because they are icons, and you know, where I grew up, in fact in the town I grew up is the town where Albert Einstein went to school. So, and I studied in Switzerland where Albert Einstein, in fact, I was born in Bern, where there's the Swiss Patent Office, and Albert Einstein was actually a patent examiner at the patent office in Bern, and developed his special theory of relativity while being a civil servant in his spare time. So, you know, and everybody knows Albert Einstein. He is a magic figure and there are lots of anecdotes about him, and so, you know, he was some sort of a, you know, he was probably the first scientific superstar. But I didn't know him, nor did I really know his work. But I had the good fortune that at the university I did my undergraduate work. There were very, very considerable scientists at work. That I already mentioned Werner Aber, who got the Nobel Prize. And there were other scientists of incredibly strong international reputation, and of course the Biocenter in Basel was really a hub of people who came to visit, and across was the Roche Institute of Immunology that was also doing some incredibly good work and has subsequently seen two people of its staff to be awarded the Nobel Prize. So, you know, I was then suddenly in a field where, as a student, some of your teachers and some of the people who had interactions with your institute were at really the absolute top level in your field. And that was a stimulation, and that was, it taught you two lessons. It taught you that, well, obviously these people have done extraordinary things in their field, and that they have retained a great degree of humility, and you know, on the one hand they're stars, and on the other hand they're you know, they're fellow human beings open to being questioned, and that was a great experience, and you know, one can learn from something like this.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, nothing like inspiration to get you involved and get you moving, so to speak, in a direction that would be a challenge. How much time daily did you spend learning the skills that helped you the most in school? I mean, if you can go back to maybe there was different amounts of time at different stages, but the idea here is, you know, to give someone, you know, looking at this, an idea of what it would take, you know, starting early, say in grade school, in high school, and in college. Did you have to put a lot of time in your work to really?
You know, to be really honest, I wasn't a particularly good pupil. I wasn't really working terribly hard. I tried to do, you know, I should say this off the record, but I tried to do the minimum. I even had to repeat one class at some stage, and so it was only really at university where I realised, okay, well, it's not just about passing anymore, because, well, passing is one thing, but passing is not the issue. Now it's a matter of doing well, because that is where it goes. And yeah, so
you changed your game, so to speak,
yeah,
at college.
Yeah,
you got more serious, and you said, "Look, I got to really pursue this."
Yeah, and it was because it was only, you know, at school it was just a matter of getting by, and whereas at university then it suddenly became different, because it was obvious that without certain grades one wouldn't get postgraduate scholarships.
Sure.
And one wouldn't get offered the relevant positions necessary to do a PhD and advance, and go to universities of considerable standing. So it really was, you know, I was never thinking about grades before I went to university. And there it changed. I decided, well, you know, now the play is over. Now we want some performance.
Well, I think your comments, your comments are quite germane, because many students would look at this and say, wow, here's a student who was not necessarily the top one in his class, but he has risen to high levels of achievement in spite of that. And that would give all of the students out there a lot of encouragement that because they don't perceive themselves as being tremendously capable in school, that in fact long term, putting in the work, developing that
Yeah.
discipline over time, you can be highly successful.
Yeah, and you see, what was a little bit of a concern at school is everything we did, for instance in the sciences, was repeating someone else's experiments. So we did reactions in chemistry, we somehow knew the outcome. It was basically not very creative, and I didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then at university, the more you go on, the more you are actually starting to be confronted with questions. And this is the wonderful thing I tell my graduate students. They say, well, what's the answer? I say, actually, I have no idea. The challenge and the beauty of it is to answer questions no one has answered. Well, in fact, to pose questions no one may have posed in this particular way, because let's not forget, in science, to answer a question is really one thing, but to ask a question is almost equally difficult, because the biologists need to ask the question, what is life? But what is life is not a question that translates into an experiment. So what we really do is we're trying to take things apart and break things down into types of fundamental questions that we in fact think we can tackle. And so now to go back to the educational thing, I think it's important, and it will be especially important here at KAUST, where we have a graduate program only, to make sure that the students realise from quite early on, you're not here to memorise answers to questions that have already been answered. That is one part, but the next step you need to learn is actually come up with questions that you think you can answer and no one really has answered, or no one has answered in this particular way. So I think that is the essence of graduate training.
Mm-hmm. We talked about you learning skills along the way in the time you spend in doing that. What are the key skills that a student needs to have, in your view, to pursue academics, to pursue research, to be a scientist?
Well, first of all, what you can never do as a student, or then as a scientist, is fall back on what you have learned and then think that's good enough to answer any problems. I think the main skill is that you learn how to teach yourself, that you learn how to learn, that you understand what's outside, and that you actually develop a real learning culture for yourself, and then start to move forward. And so the most important thing is to learn how to learn science, to learn how science is done. I mean, to actually, and to learn learning, to basically, approach a topic and say, well, what do I know? Okay. Now, what can I learn? And that you teach yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in other words, one of the studies that they've done has shown that students who have that capability, many homeschool students actually have that capability where they learn how to take a subject and go after it on their own, rather than having someone teach them step by step what the contents of that subject. And that is an essential skill in college, because you have a large amount of material and you have to cover that pretty rapidly. So you have to go after those subjects that haven't been explained to you.
That's right. Yeah. And I've, it's also, it takes a bit of understanding to realise what you don't know. It may sound trivial, but you encounter students who actually have a very hazy idea of what they know, and they have an even hazier idea of what they don't know. And that takes a bit of maturity, that takes also a bit of, a bit of interaction with other people, with your teachers, with your professors, so that you get a feeling where you stand. And to give you an example, if all I'd do today would be very closely related to what I was taught as a student, I would not be here. I can tell you my PhD thesis reads almost like a history book. The pace of change is so rapid that if you're not prepared to continuously upgrade your knowledge, you will not be part of the game. And so the learning and the developing yourself and your skill set is the most important thing. Now, one thing you can learn with any skill set is how one acquires knowledge. So that's not so much dependent on the topic itself. There are methods that you can learn, and you can question yourself, now how well have I understood something? But the actual content is incredibly rapidly changing, and you have to accept that, and you have to understand that if you're in science, the learning will not end, no matter where you stand.
We always talk about circumstances that one finds himself in, and the advantages or disadvantages that they may have on your aspirations. What circumstances in your childhood contributed most to your reaching your goals, even to this day, that you can look back on?
Well, I think I was privileged that in my family, education, and in particular higher education, was actually considered a very positive value. In fact, it was understood that that one would want to make a major effort to learn and that education was the tool to, I'd say, a successful life. Because it actually goes beyond the career. I could have said a successful career, but I think it goes further than a career. I think a career is something you have, which is isolated from the rest of your life. But I think that's another thing. When you are actually devoting your life, or a large part of your life, to science, this is much more than a career. This is, in fact, a way of life. And I have been encouraged to be very serious about my professional development. I was encouraged to understand that if one spends such a large part of one's life at work, work must surely be a place where you get a large amount of, tremendous amount of good experiences, satisfaction, where you have rewards,
right.
And so my parents have been very supportive.
Cultivated that in you.
Yeah.
What would be the circumstances, not necessarily only in your life, but in the lives of youth growing up, that would be the highest risk to not obtaining goals? I mean, in terms of, thoughts that might come to mind that would benefit students today.
Well, when I decided to go to university and study science, and then become a scientist, it was straightforward that you cannot be a scientist without going all the way. So basically, to have a degree in science will not make you a scientist. So it was incredibly clear that if you want to become a scientist, you must go all the way. And you know, while I wasn't feeling anxious particularly during exams or in the preparations towards exam, it was actually clear that one needed to perform at a certain level to actually take the next steps. So, you know, in that sense, it was competitive. It wasn't competitive in numbers.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't there are 20 in the class and only 5 take the next level. It was more like the 20 in the class, either all or none. In an extreme case, can do well, but only those who do well will have a chance to move on. So I think that's the point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you say go all the way, do you mean get a PhD?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Now that's what I mean.
Right.
I would basically make that incredibly clear that I cannot imagine, and I don't know anybody who has a reasonable position as a research scientist without a PhD in my field. Biochemistry, the molecular biology side of the life sciences require a PhD. Without a PhD, you haven't got access to government funding to do fundamental research. You will always be some sort of a technician without a PhD. And a technician is exactly what you don't want to be if you're a scientist. If science is the goal, then a PhD is the essential step towards it.
Well, that's so. What were the things that made you understand that? Say at the point in the career where you had to make a decision, because many people will stop at a master's or even at a bachelor's, and they're very interested in being scientists.
Sure.
So obviously something came along. Maybe you had a mentor, or you had a family member, or you came up with it on your own. That hey, I need to go to this level to achieve my goal.
Well, okay, so let me be positive at the beginning. There are plenty of people who get a bachelor or a master's and have great career options, but not in research. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to be a research scientist, and I didn't know there and then a single research scientist without a PhD. It was so obvious it needed no interpretation. I knew I wanted at some stage be an academic, lead my own research group, compete for grants, government grants, etc. And when you see grant application forms, it's straightforward. If you don't click the PhD box, well, you're not part of the raffle, so to speak.
So I mean, this is a really good message for a student now to listen at an early stage in their student career, to hear you say this, because it may take them some time to come to those conclusions, but you are laying it out quite frankly and dramatically to them.
It's that's what it is.
Sure,
I mean, that's
the reality.
Exactly.
How would you describe your most effective methods for studying and learning, that you developed over the years in school?
Well, I think it is some sort of a matter of using some self-control systems. I mean, you got to know when you know something. I mean, you need to be able to understand yourself well enough to know, now I know this. The people who don't know when they know something are actually in trouble, because they think they know and then they don't, and they flounder. So I always used to try to explain things to myself. Now maybe the Krebs cycle, which is a classic biochemical pathway, do I know the Krebs cycle? Well, I try to explain it to myself, and if I don't understand it, well, I obviously haven't understood it. it sounds almost trivial, but it's incredibly important to try to be able to explain things to oneself and sort of almost hear how one phrases it to oneself and then ask oneself, does that make sense? And of course, there is a certain amount of repetition that is required. There are very few people who can look at something, understand it, and memorize it for the rest of one's life. So most of us have to do things more than once, have to go over things, they have to repeat things, and tackle things from different angles. And of course there's the short to long-term memory. I mean, you know, we all have learned things for exams and then happily forgotten them afterwards. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are certain things which we're not supposed to forget, and
They become tools for
yeah,
further learning.
You know,
And the other point about that is that you talk about repetition, and you also talk about the fact that you have to be able to explain it to yourself. So actually, that leads to the idea that maybe when you try to explain it to someone else, so that someone else can understand that you really are moving along in your understanding. Teaching is the ultimate learning device.
Of course. I mean, you know, I'm ashamed to say that I really only knew my biochemistry by heart, so to speak, when I started teaching undergraduates. And that's okay. I mean, I have understood it beforehand, but when I had to teach it, well, then it was really a matter of explaining it to you with a piece of chalk in my hand on the blackboard. So it's a sort of an enhanced way of doing it. I mean, it becomes almost like second nature.
Did you always seek out other references in courses that would sort of cross-reference material that was in the assigned textbook as a strategy as well?
Yes, that was one thing, and I was actually very lucky in the sense that we had several of our lecturers who were very much at the forefront of their research, and they taught us things which were not in the textbooks by the time they lectured it, because it was sort of freshly off their own press, and the only way of understanding it was to look at the lecture notes and to probably read some very up-to-date literature. And you know, the textbook is ultimately, you know, it's a foundation, but you would expect it at graduate level. What we do is go beyond the textbook and start to understand, you know, what is being done, you know, or what has been done in the last half a year, in the last year.
So you're looking at peer-reviewed papers in major journals.
Yes, and you know, these major journals, many of them are actually in the public domain. So you don't even need a subscription. You go to PubMed, you click on these journals, and they come off.
What are the most significant breakthroughs in science in general that you predict over the next 10 years, 25 years, 50 years? This is a broad question.
Well, first of all, I can tell you what I think is going to happen in the fields we're tackling now. There may be revolutions where we don't even have an idea of the questions at the moment. But what I can see now in my field, what's becoming very important, is that we are moving from understanding components of biological systems, such as the cell, the nucleus, DNA replication, signal transduction, etc. We are starting single genes, protein, gene DNA interactions, DNA protein interactions, etc. We're starting to understand these things increasingly better. Now, we will go further in both directions. On an analytical level, we will basically start to understand molecular interactions better at the level of single atoms. So that is going to be the resolution. I mean, the resolution will be unbelievably big. We will
The nano level.
well, yeah. I mean, really, angstrom. We will be seeing in proteins, in catalytic sensors, we will be seeing single electrons move, I suppose. And on the other side, we will look at how the whole system works. And both the sort of nano and the systems level will require a huge amount of data that can only be managed through computational tools. So I think we will be doing a lot more analytical, front-end analytical and systems level biology, and we will be doing both branches of the extreme, the macro and the micro, only with the support of very strong computational setups and computational skills, because it's not just the hardware, it's computational methods as well that need to be developed to look at high throughput biology and at the resolution of nanostructures.
You mentioned asking the right questions several times in your previous answers, and what are the most important scientific questions or problems facing the world, say, over the next 15 years?
Well, now, I would almost like to break this up. I think there are incredibly important questions the world is going to face. And I reckon for some of these problems, in fact, science can contribute to all of these problems, but I do not believe that science alone can bring the change. Now, we have to be very careful, because science is a tool and science is a method. Science is not necessarily the practical answer to the problem. Science can provide some practical answers. To what degree these answers will then be made beneficial to society is unfortunately not in the hand of scientists, or only to a relatively small degree. So, population explosion is a huge problem. Producing enough food without jeopardizing the species variety and number on Earth is a huge problem. Making sure that we have enough fresh water at hand is a huge problem. To be sure that pollution isn't really making this place, the Earth, uninhabitable. These are huge problems. And science has a role in solving or contributing to the solution of all of them. But let's make no mistake, I'm saying this again, it takes not just a scientist, it takes society as a whole to turn potentially beneficial scientific solutions and technical solutions into something that makes the world a better place for all of us.
So you were talking about solutions. How would your work contribute potentially to solution? You mentioned a couple of the problems, for example, food.
Yeah.
And how would your work connect to that?
Well, there are 2 points. Well, first of all, in the most general way, we obviously need plants as food. And it is understood that the environmental conditions may even deteriorate from what they are now. So traditional breeding methods may not be sufficient to actually guarantee food security. So understanding plant stress responses and understanding biological systems can make a major contribution to guaranteeing food security. And that's at many levels. In fact, if genetic engineering is used properly and responsibly, I think it can easily be argued that it does solve some problems and or produce environmentally more friendly solutions than we have at the moment. So there's no doubt in my mind that what we are doing is beneficial, but again, it's got to be in the hand of the right people, and it's got to be, these solutions got to be managed in a way that is socially responsible, actually is the word, and must not end up in the hands of greedy components that have other interests than the good of the people. That's what it is.
This might be one of the more difficult questions, but perhaps not. Please explain your area of research in terms which are understandable to the general public, and then I have a follow-up on that in terms of what it might mean for Saudi Arabia in particular.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in understanding what a plant does in response to stress. Now, you know, if an animal is thirsty, we can walk to a tap or to a lake or to a fountain. Plants cannot move. So therefore, their responses to environmental changes must be very effective. And different plants, different species are obviously adapted to different growth conditions. So obviously a palm tree can grow with relatively little water. Now, the same is true for a cactus, other plants cannot. So we are learning, we're trying to learn of those species that can survive under difficult conditions, what they do know in terms of adaptation, that crop plants, on which we ultimately depend, do not. We're also looking at different strains of crop plants because different strains, different races have different resistance to particular stress conditions, and we also understand that there are particular mutants that do certain things better than others. Now we're trying to find the molecular and genetic reasons for these differences. And once we have these differences, we don't use traditional breeding technology, but we use transgenic technology to try to bring certain traits that are beneficial in stress response to other species. And while this is in theory possible, there are major challenges. And the challenges are, we need to be sure that we are not upsetting the genetic balance in the host species, so to speak. And we need to be sure that what we see as an improvement in response to a stress response is not having a downside. So in other words, yes, we can engineer plants that you can water with seawater and they survive that and even grow. But you see, survival is not all, because a farmer is not interested in his crop surviving. A farmer is only interested in his crop producing, for instance, a good grain yield. So to offset an increase in resistance with a loss in yield is not the goal. So, and in order to understand that, it's not just a matter of finding resistance genes and engineering them into transgenic plants, it's a matter of understanding the response at the systems level. I think that's the most general way to say it.
Right. Because I mean, that leads to the question, it seems to the layman's mind a simple proposition. You find the genes that do code for saltwater tolerance or drought tolerance, and you just put them in the food plants and and move on. You know,
Yeah.
but it's not that simple. And obviously, you might create a plant that's not as resistant to rust or,
That's
or,
right.
or,
That's right.
or some other
Yeah.
some other problem.
Yeah,
And
or you have a master gene that you've transferred, and that gene turns on the resistance mechanism. But the resistance mechanism, in order to operate,
suppresses.
takes so much energy
Yeah, yeah.
that you're actually losing it in your goal, and the goal is the filling of the maize kernel or the filling of the barley.
Right. That's right. So okay, let's presuppose that you have a breakthrough. What would that mean for Saudi Arabia?
Well, every country has, well, especially countries in the arid and semi-arid zone, have what is called marginal land. And marginal land is land on which some crops can just survive and produce a relatively low return. Now, if one was capable of increasing, for instance, the yield through increasing drought resistance of certain species, it could basically lead to an increase in agricultural production. It could lead to a better land use, and it could make farming profitable and viable in areas that are at the moment called marginal. So this is quite considerable. It could, in that sense, actually make a contribution to food security in Saudi Arabia.
Right now, I understand that there are probably 16,000 square kilometers of Saudi Arabia that are presently under irrigation and presumably agriculture. And the country is 2.25 million square kilometers. So that has an enormous possibilities for converting vast tracts of desert into
that's
farmland.
That's one thing. The other thing is irrigation leads to an increase in salinity in the ground. So even the irrigated land today is actually deteriorating, and increased salt resistance in plants is very beneficial. It's very important to do this in marginal and irrigated agriculture, because we know from California, for instance, and also in Australia, that an awful lot of the land that was irrigated is actually producing
It's getting more.
It's building up saline, because what happens is there is some residual salt in the water. Now you spray that or you irrigate it, you have evaporation, and the salt is accumulating in the ground, and also because the water table may fluctuate, you don't get rid of the salt.
So even in Imperial Valley in California, where they have one of the major agricultural productive areas of the world, there is also that risk. So your research obviously has much broader implications for the entire planet.
I mean, it is common knowledge that irrigated systems, particularly in semi-arid zones, will produce salinisation of the ground, and that needs addressing. There are many ways of doing it, but of course, the more salt resistant your plants are,
the better you have it. How long do you think it will take to have a breakthrough? I mean, you obviously sit down and make projections about going through these problem-solving steps that you know you have to do in the lab, and also collaborating with teams around the world. Do you see that as imminent or in the distant future?
Well, you see, that's actually an interesting question, because there are plenty of reports, and my research group has also contributed to them, that show to you that you can have increased salt resistance. You can actually engineer it. The problem is not the making of a more salt-tolerant plant. The question is, why have they not moved into field trial stage? And there we're really talking about that famous metabolic balance and basically making sure that the gain is not just a gain of a trait, but that you actually get an agriculturally viable payback, and that's the problem. And I'm not sure. I reckon it will happen relatively soon. I think we will be seeing more drought and salinity resistant plants in the field within the next 10 years.
Why did you come to King Abdullah University of Science and Technology
Well,
to pursue your research?
yeah. Well, I think what this place offers is, I think, a vision, and it offers an unparalleled infrastructure and a multidisciplinary approach to answer problems, to answer scientific problems. And what is very attractive is that obviously very good people have been hired, very dynamic people have been hired, and that the emphasis is on a multidisciplinary approach to scientific problems. And I think that is where one of the strengths will be, and I am very hopeful that this approach will lead to some very commendable results in several areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I reckon one of the areas will be plant stress response and plant biology and down the track agriculture in particular.
Maybe you can comment briefly on the fact that you have a two centers that will be working very closely at CAUS that will be pursuing these goals that you have described so far, namely the plant stress group, which you will be a part of, as well as the computational bioscience group.
I think, as I have mentioned a couple of times in this interview, there are two ways that we make progress these days. One is through an accumulation of large data sets, so that is in fact the biochemical part and the molecular biology part, and of course, because the data set is so huge and we're looking at whole genomes and whole proteomes, we're looking at 20,000 proteins changing their intensity in response to stimuli. It is not possible to work at that level manually or by inspection by eye. So computational methods need to be developed and or applied to integrate these data sets and actually interpret what comes out. So I really reckon that one of the successes of the plant biology operation here will be a very close collaboration between the experimental side and the computational side.
Just a couple more questions and we'll let you go back to your lab. What would you consider the greatest achievement that you've made so far in your profession?
Well, I think it's difficult to pinpoint particular breakthroughs, but I think overall I have contributed very significantly to stress signaling in plants. I have looked at the role of several signaling molecules. We have, for instance, established a particular signaling molecule as very important in the downstream signaling of stress hormones and stresses in general. I have, together with my group, discovered a new hormone which belongs to a completely new type of hormones in plants, because plant hormones have been understood as being relatively small amino acid derivatives. Now we have discovered a hormone that is in fact a peptide hormone, much the way they operate in plants, and these hormones now turn out to be very important in the regulation of the water and iron status of plants, and of course the water and iron status is a key to drought and salinity responses. And I also work...
Is that the plant nutrient peptide,
yeah,
PNPs?
yeah.
Okay.
Plant natriuretic peptides are peptides that turn out to play a very important role in integrating and signaling the water status of a plant within the plant, and they are playing a role as a peptidic hormone, which is very unusual in plants. A peptidic hormone that regulates homeostasis, which is basically the regulation of water and iron balance.
So what does the second messenger, CGMP, what does that accomplish?
Well,
plant signaling.
Yeah, well, CGMP turns out to be involved in many downstream processes of hormones, but it's also a very important messenger of light intensity, which is very crucial to plant life. So maybe I should say what a second messenger is. A second messenger basically is a molecule that links an environmental stimulus, often via a receptor, to all downstream responses of the plant, including a change of the transcriptional program and the proteome. So, how does intensity of the light change the gene expression program?
Right.
Now that needs messengers. And one of the second messengers we've discovered, well, we have discovered CGMP. We've only discovered some of its functions, but we were the first to show a molecule, a protein, that can actually make CGMP. So the maker of this molecule. And we're now discovering more and more different molecules that can do this, and we clearly are the leading group on Earth that works on the molecules that make this second messenger.
I noticed when I did a search on that term, everything came up, had your name linked to it.
Well, not exactly everything, but
pretty much, yeah.
But we do a lot of this work.
Sure. I want to ask you a kind of a broad question that links to the signaling. I heard in a book, I saw in a book that I was looking at, where when you go back to the central dogma of biology, in that the gene, the DNA produces RNA, which is carried out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm and to the ribosomes to produce a given protein. And so that leads to the thought that the analogy is that the DNA would be the brains of the cell. Now, given that you have these signaling processes that happen at the cell membrane, and they cross the cell membrane, can we redefine the central dogma and say that the brains are really more closely associated with the cell membrane, because it will determine what comes in and out to create the signaling to the DNA?
Well, I would...
The upregulation of the DNA.
I would put it this way. The DNA itself is like a computer program. Now, the DNA in most of our cells is the same. So, for instance, the DNA in our epithelium cells in our guts is the same as the DNA in our brain cells. But, of course, we want a different program to work in our brain cells, because we want these brain cells to make neurotransmitters, etc., whereas we want our gut cells to secrete trypsin and other digestive enzymes. So, obviously, the blueprint, the DNA blueprint, is essential, but it's not the switch. So you need to switch particular programs on and off. And that, in turn, requires messengers. And some of these messengers are actually proteins, so they're also encoded by DNA. So I think, that this brings me back to the idea that looking at a single gene, a single messenger, is one thing we do today, but more and more we're interested in understanding the complete system. And systems biology is interested in looking at the complete, not just DNA, but the complete transcriptomic program, the complete protein program. And we also know, that, for instance, a gene makes a protein, yes, well, a gene encodes a protein. But now, this protein in itself, once it has been made, may not be active. It may require, for instance, that some residue is phosphorylated. And it may require that this phosphorylation may require the presence of a second messenger. So you have a direct activation of a protein, almost independent of the gene that encoded for this protein. That the activation is going independently of the gene directly via a second messenger. Right. The second messenger in turn may be influenced by environmental stimulus.
Like sunlight, for example.
For instance, sun can...
Or cold,
or
a hot
exactly,
heat.
So, the idea that once you know every single gene, you know everything about nature and biology, now that we are way beyond that.
Yeah, just a couple more questions here. It's astonishing that the plant that you utilize in your studies, Arabidopsis,
yes,
has 27,000 genes, and it produces, up to now, we know 35,000 proteins. That implies an incredible complexity in a very simple plant.
Yes.
And it almost matches, in terms of the number of genes, what's in the human genome. What can we draw from this? I mean, does that mean that nature has produced a plant which we look at as relatively simple, but in fact there's an incredible amount of processes that go on in that plant that belie its simplicity?
Simple is, of course, a difficult term to use in a way. I mean, plants are very, very complex. I mean, photosynthesis, as an example, or these signaling between different parts of plants, and all the very, very complex operation that needs to work in defense against pathogens. Many of these processes actually have almost homologous systems in animals. So I think simple, we think of plants as simple because they seem to be so small and they can grow very quickly with just a little bit of water, sunlight, and if you stick them in the earth, that's that. I think they're not simple. And of course, there are lots of very interesting things we can learn from plants, and many of the mechanisms are actually very similar to mechanisms in humans or other species. I think there are certain themes that hold for all life forms we know, and some are specializations. And of course, now when you talked about genes, you see, it's also interesting that actually a very small part of the DNA in each cell actually forms genes. There's a lot of DNA that is there that does not encode any proteins. And there was in the 80s and 90s the disparative term of junk DNA. Right. It just so happens that it can't just be junk, because we are starting to see some structural patterns emerging in there, and I think there's a lot more in there than meets the eye. So
it's like the dark matter in the universe. It's one of those enigmas as to what its real function is. Okay, two more questions. One is, describe a typical working day for you in your profession. From the time you get up and you go to your lab, and what do you do? This would be instructive to a student who might consider this career.
No, well, I mean, I'm skipping having the shower and eating.
Yeah, sure. That's routine that everybody does.
That's yeah. So the very first thing I do when I get into my office is make myself a cup of tea. I have a teapot in my office, and while I'm making the tea, I think of some of the major problems and themes, or rethink of the major problems and themes I wish to tackle for today. And then I sit down. I look at the mail. I see, because I have international collaborations in different time zones. So I normally, before I leave the office, I ask my colleagues questions in Australia. In the morning, their day is over. They've done something. I get up and I see there's maybe a new figure on, ready for a paper, or questions asked, and we have discussion points that have been resolved. So there's sort of a correspondence phase, and then I make sure that every day I have several hours where I process manuscripts in preparation. So I look at figures, I write, I read, I continue assembling and writing papers, and I will either do some experiments or talk to my graduate students about the planning of experiments, etc., etc., etc. So it's not always easy to find long uninterrupted stretches of thinking and doing scientific work, but I think it's important that we try to do as much of it as we can. And of course, there is some teaching and some administration, which is apparently...
What about work in a lab?
I do very few experiments myself, but I will be in the lab supervising my students or being with them, discussing with them what needs doing at the bench. So I make sure that I am very closely related or closely involved with the actual planning and doing a particular series of experiments, particularly if the student or the groups of students haven't done them before.
The last question is, what is your definition of success?
I tell you, for me the highest parameter is the producing scientific experiments which and scientific results, and the package is the planning, the doing, the writing up, and finally the publishing. So when we publish scientific papers in highly respected international peer-reviewed journals, that to me marks the successful conclusion of a set of experiments. And it still gives me, after so many years of research, a great feeling of joy and relief. And it's like spring cleaning. I've done, this is it, we can leave it at that, we can take the next step. Mm-hmm. And with that comes then, once a paper is out, these papers develop a life of their own, other people cite it, some people comment on it, etc. And it's great to produce something that has an echo. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so for me having this echo is great. And of course, when I say for me, I mean of course for the people in my group, because my research is in essence the research of my postdoctoral students, of my PhD students and the master students. So when I say I do and I have done, then of course I mean my team together with me, or I together with my team have done. So the experimental biological sciences are great team efforts, and one cannot overestimate underestimate the importance of that team bit. Nothing I've done, or very few things I've done in my career, I have done entirely on my own in isolation. So I think that's it. And of course, I have just last week graduated 2 PhD students. They've just had their thesis approved.
Congratulations.
Yes, and I can honestly tell you that was, of course, a proud moment for myself too. I think, yeah, well, okay, so this is a real contribution.
Any parting words for particularly students who may have heard the comments you've made so far? Any parting words?
Okay, parting words. Don't be discouraged when things don't go the way you think they should. Discouragement is to be discouraged. So I want to see enthusiasm, and I want to see also the playful element of it and the joyful element of it. It's actually, it shouldn't be a punishment, and it isn't. It's a great way to spend a good part of one's life, and it should be approached as something positive that gives joy. And I can honestly say many of my colleagues are very happy people and wouldn't want to do anything but science, and they do this with great conviction.